1980 Labour Party conference was arguably the most turbulent in the party's recent history. And it's quite a competitive field for turbulence in Labour Party conferences. But all sorts of things were going on at that conference. Shirley Williams warned of a fascism of the left. Tony Benn was at his mesmeric peak. And during a week of extraordinary open public civil war, it emerged that the leader of the party, James Callaghan, was going. And a TV news bulletin did something interesting when this announcement emerged. It ended its bulletin with a little sequence. On the platform, they showed Jim Callaghan indicating this dramatic news that he was going. And then the camera drifted to the front row of the conference floor. And the news bulletin ended on a close-up of Denis Healey. The clear implication of the news bulletin, clearly the assumption of that editor and many others, was that Denis Healey would succeed Jim Callaghan. It didn't happen then, and it didn't happen on another occasion, which we'll come to during this talk, when Healey thought once again he might throw his hat in the ring. It never happened. And yet, of all the prime ministers we never had, Healey was in some ways hugely qualified for the job. And interestingly, better qualified in some respects than many of those who became prime minister. Not least, he had, by 1980, when that TV editor clearly thought he was going to be the successor, immense cabinet experience. He had been from 1964 to 1970 the Defence Secretary in Harold Wilson's government, a big task for a Labour cabinet minister. He lasted that whole period, spanned the 1966 general election. He hoped at times to have been made Foreign Secretary. He wasn't during that period. But to remain Defence Secretary and to impress many of those he dealt with in that job was an achievement. Then, famously, in 1974, after the February election, Healey became Chancellor in the most titanic of circumstances. The hung Parliament, raging inflation, the miners' strike, and many other union pay claims to come. It was a tough, tough time to be Chancellor, and he survived the course. He was the only Chancellor in that government, was still Chancellor by May 1979 when they were booted out of power. So there he was sitting there in 1980 at that turbulent conference as a former Chancellor and a former Defence Secretary. He had other major qualifications for being a potential and actual Prime Minister. He had an extraordinary career before he got those cabinet jobs, an extraordinary life really. His autobiography, is one of the best written by a former politician. And as you read it with admiration and kind of envy. He had crammed so much into his life by the time he got into politics. At 18, before he went off to Oxford, he took time out for a few months and cycled around Germany. This was in the 1930s, the rise of Hitler. In fact, I think he was there the summer of the Munich Olympics. And he learnt a lot from that, and he began to speak the language of German, and he could speak many other languages quite soon after that. He had, by the time he went to Oxford, read most of the great novelists, not just the British ones, of which, interestingly, his hero was Virginia Woolf. He had read most of the Russian novelists. He loved poetry. A music and English teacher took a shine to him and introduced him to all the great classical composers. Rather like Michael Foot, who plays a part in this story, he was remarkably well read. He was gripped too by politics in Oxford. This was pre-war Oxford. He joined the Communist Party largely on grounds of foreign affairs. He regarded the Communist Party as the one most unequivocally opposed to Hitler's regime in Germany. And it was foreign affairs really that defined his politics through the decades. And he ached, as I said, to be Foreign Secretary. So by the time he became active in politics, he had had already an extraordinarily rich life. It was said of him that he had a hinterland, and he really did. And I put that in largely as a qualification for being Prime Minister. You need range and depth. It's not a compulsory qualification like some of the others, but it should help. So Healey had this dimension to him. He was also, in a way that's quite counterintuitive, quite popular. And his popularity manifested itself in a strange way. Because as Chancellor, we're going to come on to this, he had to take some really tough decisions. He was a Chancellor who rarely was a metaphorical Santa Claus, giving away gifts in his many budgets, almost the opposite. But to a nation of TV watchers, he was quite often an actual Santa Claus. He was an exuberant personality, and he enjoyed, as Chancellor, appearing on the mass-watched programmes of that era. He dressed up as Santa Claus on Bruce Forsyth's Generation Game, and the contestants had to guess who it was behind all the garb. He appeared in Morecambe and Wise. And he was one of the first, if you like, celebrity politicians, the ones now who present Have I Got News for You and all the rest of it. He was an early version, and he did it as Chancellor. So he kind of emerged from that traumatic period in power as someone with a popular touch. And he was a resilient, robust politician too. The most vivid example of this, it remains extraordinary if you watch it on YouTube, was when, as Chancellor, during the 1976 Labour conference, Healey, because of the financial crisis in Britain, was flying off to Manila to attend a vital meeting of the International Monetary Fund. Hearing that the Labour conference was about to vote down his package of spending cuts that he regarded as necessary to get a loan from the IMF, he famously didn't take his flight. He turned back from the airport, dashed up to the Labour Party conference in Blackpool, and because he wasn't a member of Labour's ruling National Executive, he kept on getting kicked off that. He spoke from the floor like any other Labour delegate. He only had 6 minutes. After that, the red light on the podium started flashing, telling him to get back off the podium and let others speak. But for that 6 minutes, with half the hall cheering, half booing, Healey gave a robust defence of his economic policy. It would take a tough figure to do that, and on many levels he was. So let's now roll forward again to that conference in 1980. There he was, sitting there, ending a TV news bulletin with the implication he would get the crown, the heavyweight cabinet minister, the person with the wit to go on popular TV shows. I think he was the only one in that era who did it. And that range and depth that he had from his reading and travelling and his ability to speak so many languages. And yet he did not get the crown. Why? Why was it that he is one of our prime ministers who never were? And in order to answer that question, we must look briefly at what did happen in 1980 and then go deeper to the deeper reasons for his failure to become a leader and therefore prime minister. In 1980, The leadership contest that followed that turbulent conference was the last where MPs alone were going to elect a leader. And that should have been an advantage to Denis Healey. If it had been the membership, as it was about to be, he would have had less chance. But as a parliamentary party contest, he began as clear favourite. It was Michael Foot who won that leadership contest, say another bibliophile, utterly addicted to writers, had his heroes from the worlds of literature and the arts, and he won. A figure well to the left of Denis Healey. Why was that? And the answer actually is contained partly in some of the things I've already been saying about him. The things I've been saying about him that applied a greatness that was genuinely there also were the seeds of Healey's downfall in terms of leadership, not least his period as Chancellor. I mentioned earlier how robust he was in defence of an economic policy which involved tough spending cuts. If you remember how unpopular George Osborne was as the austerity chancellor, booed at the Olympics, Healey had to impose a similar level of cuts in order to get a loan from the International Monetary Fund. Labour was in charge of a common economy in crisis. The reasons for that were complicated and not just down to them by any means. And Healey, to get to the position where even Jim Callaghan, the then Prime Minister, was to back him, had to fight many internal battles. The cabinet, and they had big cabinet discussions in that era, were split at least three ways. Denis Healey not only faced Tony Benn, who put forward his alternative economic strategy, public spending increases, import controls, much greater state ownership. He also faced from the so-called centre-left Tony Crosland, who believed that growth could be generated partly through some public spending increases. He backed some of Healey's package, but by no means all of it. So Healey was in a minority at times in his own cabinet. Without the backing of Callaghan, he would have probably not got his own economic policy through. Now think about the wider Labour Party, well to the left of that cabinet and moving leftwards. They began in many ways unfairly, but not, as it turned out, altogether incorrectly, to not only oppose the scale of the cuts, but to target their venom on Denis Healey. The viewers of Morecambe and Wise might have liked him, or the impersonator Mike Yarwood, who humanised him by doing an impression of Denis Healey where he went around saying, "Oh, you silly billies," and things, something Healey never actually said in reality. But the Labour Party members were not wooed by any of that. They began to loathe him. He became, in some respects, the least popular member of that cabinet from the perspective of the Labour Party membership. And by 1980, all kinds of things were happening. The so-called Gang of Four who formed the SDP were stirring. They hadn't left by 1980, but were stirring and making their moves. Michael Foot had by then surfaced. He's sort of now, there's a stereotype of Michael Foot of the left-wing rebel who as a leader just wrote this 1983 manifesto about, so left-wing that it was described as the longest suicide note in history. But actually by 1980, Michael Foot had become more of a conciliator. He had been Jim Callaghan's deputy. He had been an essential figure at times in keeping the cabinet and the parliamentary party together. He had close relationships with the trade unions. So Michael Foot was elected leader rather than Denis Healey, partly because of that recently discovered expediency, as well as the fact that he was unquestionably a figure to the left of Denis Healey and closer in policy terms to the mood of the party. So Healey lost, to his surprise. And that tells us something else, which is about the personality of the prime ministers that we never had. There is something in a lot of them, not all by any means, that lacked the necessary drive and guile to get to the very top. Denis Healey's very love of the arts and poetry, his fantastically close relationship with his wife, Edna, were as important to him throughout all of this as politics. Others were more driven by political ambition. And Healey, for all his robust fighting spirit, also had almost a shy integrity as well. He didn't manoeuvre and wheel and deal for the leadership. There were not in the parliamentary Labour Party Healeyites, as there were in relation to Roy Jenkins, Jenkinsites, and in relation to Tony Crossland, Crosslandites. He didn't have followers. Indeed, he stood in one of the most momentous leadership contests Labour has ever staged in 1976. Momentous because the candidates were all titans in their different ways. It was when Wilson had left and Callaghan won. Healey stood. So did Michael Foot, who did much better than Healey then. So did Tony Crossland. They were, all of them, giants. Anyway, in that election in 1976, Healey won only 30 votes. So, retrospectively, although it was clear at the time, it was not going to be Healey's in 1980. And he tried or reflected to try again in 1983, after Labour had been slaughtered. Healey, and this is a very interesting and a quality that is now, I think, passing, Healey at no point contemplated leaving politics to make a lucrative career in the city or on television. After losing that 1980 contest, instead of saying, right, that's it, I've had enough, he became Foot's loyal deputy and shadow foreign secretary. They made a strange pairing, the two of them, over the next 3 years. They disagreed on nuclear defence. Healey was a multilateralist, Foot was a unilateralist. They disagreed on Europe. Healey was broadly pro-European. At that point, Michael Foot wanted out of the then common market. They disagreed on economic policy. But Healey, on the whole, remained loyal to Foot. He had to withstand a mighty deputy leadership battle against Tony Benn in 1981, the one contest that Healey did win, but by less than 1%. So, given those 3 years of arduous loyalty, when Labour was slaughtered in 1983, Healey had some hope that perhaps then he could become leader. And there is a theory held by Roy Hattersley and several others that if he had been then, he might have had a much better chance of winning the forthcoming elections that Neil Kinnock, who did win, went on to lose. But on the night of the 83 election, union leaders, one after another, said it was time to leap a generation. It was clear to Denis Healey within hours of the 83 election that he would not have a hope of even standing in a leadership contest and didn't do so. But even then, he showed a remarkable loyalty to politics. He continued as Neil Kinnock's shadow foreign secretary for another 4 years, up until the 87 election. So a figure with economic contacts to die for, having been Chancellor, a passion for other non-political activities, stayed at the heart of the Labour Party debate in what appeared to be the eternity of opposition. And he showed again to Neil Kinnock an extraordinary level of loyalty. But by then, it was absolutely clear he would never be Foreign Secretary. He would never, ever be Prime Minister. And this, I think, points us to a fundamental lesson in Prime Ministers we never had. For sure, it would help if Denis Healey had shown more guile in the build-up, certainly to 1980, in that leadership contest where Michael Foot beat him. For sure, if he had devoted even more time to politics and wooed Labour MPs assiduously, that would have helped too. But in the end, you cannot separate an individual from their party. That is the lesson of some of the other non-prime ministers we're looking at in this series, and it's emphatically the case with Healey. You could extract him and let's say, God, he's got many leadership qualities. And in a presidential contest, maybe there would have been a President Healey. But the Labour Party at that time could not have coped with Healey as leader. There is a fantasy that if Foot had stood down before the 1983 election, Healey could have challenged Thatcher and perhaps either narrowed her majority in that landslide win, or maybe even won. It could not have happened. At least half the Labour Party would have been up in arms. It might have stopped the SDP from forming. It would have been much harder for them to form if Denis Healey had been leader from 1980. But the followers of Tony Benn, those who regarded Michael Foot almost as too much of a compromise, could not have borne it. The civil war that had broken out in the Labour Party would not have been resolved by Healey becoming leader. It would have almost been another episode in the Civil War. And so you cannot say of these prime ministers who never were, it's so obvious they should have been at a key point. There is always a relationship between party and leader. There is always a reason why a party goes for someone, even though to an outsider it looks like an act of near suicide, politically speaking. And Healey was never the fit for the Labour Party at the time when these leadership contests took place. So you have to make a different judgment. Did his contribution to the Labour Party matter anyway? And it did in several ways, even though he never reached it to number 10 or the Foreign Office. As Chancellor, he found it really tough. He was not as robust as he appeared to be. And he told me once when I interviewed him late on in his life that by the end of his period as Chancellor, he was physically ill. He found the pressures, the impossibility of dealing with the trade unions, who were the supposed allies of the Labour Party, by the end unbearable. And I think it took its toll. But by the end, at least, as he claimed in the 79 election, the economy was under control in some respects. Inflation was not as raging as it had been. And he had navigated Britain through a period where, frankly, the whole thing could have imploded without any substantial majority in the Commons. He did it by swerving this way and that. He held endless mini budgets, they were called, but they were a euphemism for actual budgets. It was a testament to political stamina and authority. He was an authority in the Treasury and much admired there. His decision not to join the SDP was also historic. While Shirley Williams, David Owen, Roy Jenkins, Bill Rogers were plotting their move to set up a new political party, the figure they wanted more than any other was Denis Healey to join them. They knew if they could get Healey, they were off, and Healey would take with him other Labour MPs. But he decided to stay, and in doing so, played a huge part, really, in the failure of the SDP to establish itself as a political party and the rebuilding of the Labour Party. So that was hugely significant. Also, I've mentioned it already, but it was titanic. As deputy leader, disappointed not to be leader, he faced this challenge from Tony Benn in 1981, the deputy leadership contest. It was the most extraordinary political battle. Tony Benn then was an orator of brilliance, and he started well behind in that campaign, but it was the first contest under Labour's so-called new electoral college. This was not just for MPs now, it was the party membership, it was the unions. And as things developed, Tony Benn's campaign got more and more coverage. He could pack out any hall in the country. And Healey had to be incredibly tough to withstand the assault from Tony Benn and his supporters. But he did. It was deeply unrewarding because at the end of it all he got was the job he had in the first place, which was one that he didn't particularly want, deputy leader of the Labour Party under Michael Foot. But he stayed the course and he won just. There is a general view, I think accurate, that if he had lost, the Labour Party would have been plunged into a deeper crisis at the time, because by then the SDP was up and running. And if Healey had been defeated and Tony Benn had become deputy leader, all kinds of things might have happened, we don't know. But the assumption that it would, in the short term at least, have helped the SDP, I think, is inescapable. So you don't have to be Prime Minister to have played momentous role in politics, and I think he goes down as one of the great titans who didn't make it to number 10. When he retired, and it was late on because of this long commitment after Labour had lost in '79, he had, wholly unsurprisingly, a deeply rewarding life in Sussex with his wife Edna. They then could devote their time to music, poetry, literature, photography. I don't think he ever spent any time anguishing over what might have been. And in that sense, he's one of the rarer prime ministers who never were, because many of them wondered if they had played things differently, they might have got it. I don't think he was troubled by that at all. He retained his good humour, his zest for life until into his 90s. And he had a fuller life than some of those who became Prime Minister.